Brought to you by SWIP Radio, another free stormwater education resource from WGR Southwest.
Okay, so really I'm just going to go through the stormwater discharge associated with industrial activity permit and how the industrial classification system works for that permit. So the regulations on industrial codes come from 40 CFR 122.26, where that defines basically what kind of industrial codes or classifications of activities need the industrial permit. There's a lot of different industrial activities. Pretty much any kind of industrial activity has an industrial code. Just because there's an industrial code doesn't mean that they need the National Pollution Discharge Elimination System permit for industrial activities. In the new permit that's effective July 1 of 2015, we have Attachment A of the industrial permit that identifies applicable activities under this permit. Most of them have an industrial code that describes the activity, but some of these sectors, if you will, cover multiple industrial codes where it's basically the activity under multiple SIC codes that you would need the permit. And we have enforcement if you are what we call a non-filer at the state and regional board, meaning that you fall under one of these categories that needs the industrial permit, but you never got a permit. We deem that as a non-filer, and there can be penalties associated with that for not getting the permit. So what do I mean when I say attachments, attachment A, what's in there? Well, we cover a lot of different manufacturing industrial codes. Even if you sew clothes and you fit into that, you would need a permit. This is where you see the ones for manufacturing circuit boards, and there's a whole bunch of them between Industrial Code 20XX and 39XX. And the XX means there's a lot of different specific industrial activities under that category of the 20 to the 39 SIC codes. We cover mining and oil and gas operations, but there is a caveat to that. But if you're wondering if you fall into that category, your SIC code would start with a 10 or a 14 with a unique 2-digit number for that kind of activity. We do cover the RCRA hazardous waste treatment, storage, and disposal facilities, and we do have some of those in the permit. Landfill operations, as you see, they don't have an industrial code specified. That's because they have multiple kinds of activities that they do that fall sometimes beyond just one industrial code. For example, garbage trucks are under transportation, and then the disposal of garbage at the final endpoint of waste is a 4953. So we don't just have one industrial code that really fits all landfill operations, but we do cover all those operations in this permit. Another example is in the recycling. There's a lot of different codes that you may think are recycling of that nature. This permit only covers 2 types of recycling. There's the 5015, which is the auto dismantling industrial code, and then there's 5093, which covers a lot of different types of recycling activities. But there is only 2 of the 50 sector that we cover in this permit traditionally. Another thing is steam electric power generation, and this is very specific to generating power from any kind of fueling source where you get steam generation to run the power turbines. And this doesn't necessarily include cogeneration or anything like that. It's very specific in the EPA's regs on what type of steam electric power generating needs a permit. But if you look in the industrial code book, there really isn't one SIC code that talks about steam electric power generating. So that's why Attachment A doesn't have a specific SIC code. And the one that we get probably the most questions on is the transportation codes, because these cover also general warehousing and storage, refrigerated warehousing, and things of that nature. you'd think they'd be in a different sector, but they're in transportation because it's the housing of goods and things of that nature. We also cover sewage treatment plants over 1 million gallons a day or more. And if you spread the sludge at the actual site of the sewage treatment plant or do vehicle maintenance, all that at the site, that would all be covered under your permit. But this permit does allow you to do beneficial spreading of sludge at an auxiliary site and potentially not get coverage for that. So we don't get too many questions on that. And then feedlots, we do cover feedlots of a certain size and the type of animals that you have. And I wanted to say one thing on the mining and oil and gas operations is that there is a federal exemption if you haven't had a reportable quantity of sheen or a hazardous material. You usually are exempt from getting this permit for those activities. But what we usually look for is some kind of berming to ensure that you really don't ever have a reportable quantity, because we'd assume that without some kind of controls that when it rained you would be having a sheen off your site. So, but there is a federal exemption for oil and mining activities that, or oil and gas operations, that don't have a reportable quantity, not the mining. So that's kind of the universe of this permit. This hasn't changed since day one. This is how it's always been. The only thing that's changed is a lot of these manufacturing industrial codes, they were kind of carved out as light industry, and in this new permit, they are no longer light industry. They either get the no exposure certification or they file a notice of intent. So these are just some examples of things that we cover. We cover salvage yards of cars. We cover MRFs, material recovery facilities, auto dismantlers. We cover all kinds of different scrap metal yards. We do cover chemical product manufacturing, electronic product manufacturing, fabricated products, lumber and wood products, textile mill products, even the sewing of them. And we also cover a lot of food manufacturing, like wineries. If you know, Campbell Soup used to be in our permit when they were manufacturing tomato products. So, you know, there are a lot of facilities under each of those codes. So before we continue into how to find more information about industrial codes, I heard there was a question on the phone from Larry.
Some of those are established like landfills, but then we've had discussions on closed landfills.
So the question is on closed landfills. Yeah, so closed landfills, what the industrial permit says is if you stabilize it with the new permit, if you stabilize it for the construction permit and get buy-off from the region, you don't need a permit for that closed landfill. But it is a regional board determination, and it has to be stabilized with the cap. So 70% cover or Russell equation, something like that, and then the region is also on board with that decision. But yeah, inactive landfills do need the permit unless they go through that process.
And without getting into our HHW discussion, saving that for later, Leo had once said that everything has to have a SIC code.
Everything does almost have a SIC code. It's pretty bizarre, some of the SIC codes they've come up with when you look at the book. But you know, there's a lot of industrial activities with SIC codes that we don't cover. So, but yeah, a lot of activities have a SIC code.
And there are some that are exempt from that because of their codes.
Yes, and these regulations, you know, this is our best translator. Even if we went to a different kind of coding system, it wouldn't really help us with kind of the activities that this permit covers until they change the Clean Water Act. Okay.
Laurel.
Yeah.
So, Laurel, I have a question for you. So I have, say, a parent company who's a manufacturer, their SIC code, but the facility is fairly new. So right now all they're doing is like R&D and maybe a little office space. So they're wondering, you know, because they kind of see themselves under the manufacturing SIC code, should they file for like an NEC because they're not manufacturers, at least not yet? Or should they file? Should they be applying a different SIC code to themselves for that facility?
The
I don't want to
question
tell them the wrong
is,
thing.
what do you do with research and development facilities?
Mm-hmm.
And if your research and development areas are not commingled with your industrial activity areas, they're considered separate and not needing coverage.
Okay.
So especially if you have a separate site where, all they're doing is R&D and they have an admin building, that they have the same SIC code as a facility that needs the permit, but they're an auxiliary kind of function to the primary company who's the manufacturer. At the time that they transition to being a manufacturer, they'd absolutely need the permit.
So you wouldn't recommend them do no exposure certification at this point if they're thinking they might be doing manufacturing more going down the line, just to kind of not be grandfathered, or to be grandfathered in at this point as an existing facility, or should they just wait till they actually have that activity?
If they're not manufacturing per the SIC code, they don't have to get a permit. They would be getting the permit with kind of outside of what Attachment A requires. For the purposes of today, that's kind of their decision, but we wouldn't require a permit for an R&D facility at that time.
Right. It is R&D now, but it's going forward. So we'll just tell them as soon as they think they're going to manufacture, then it would be applicable, but not right now. And then maybe have some sort of document in place regarding that, you think, or?
It's kind of your decision. I mean, if it's truly R&D, we have very large facilities that don't have a permit. So, if you have a bunch of stuff stored outside and things like that, I would say that's probably not the best way to do business. But there's a lot of things that look like they need a permit, but they don't. For example, there's a lot of examples I could give. Staging areas for bridge builders. Their primary activity is building bridges. That's not something we cover. It's a construction kind of code. If they have a staging area, there's no SIC code we regulate for that, even though they're dirty and have equipment. So, this is all kind of esoteric stuff of how do you make these rules? Where do they come from? And they come from there's this book. I don't know, some of you have seen me carry it around. It's a dark blue book, and it's the 1987. It's 2 years old when this thing came out, and it's this industrial classification book. And what Office of Safety and Health Administration has done is they've put the book on a website. And it is pretty much the full book, minus the preamble, which is about 2 pages, which can be helpful. But I just wanted to show you, this is the manual. This is where this all comes from. So you can use this online system to kind of go through when you need a permit and when you don't. You can see I've looked at some of these. So you would go and use the SIC codes in Attachment A, and you'd go through and see if any of that stuff describes your activity. I like to really point out in this system that you have divisions here, and under the divisions you have these industrial code groups. The division descriptions are very important to how the codes work. If you just kind of go to the code if you go to the list of codes without reading the division description, it kind of can be misleading, and I have some examples of how that can be misleading. So make sure you read the division description first and the background to how these codes work before you jump in and think you need a permit. For example, here, heavy construction, bridge, tunnel, and highway construction. That's where that bridge builder would come into play. If you look in our code, we don't have that as one of the ones that we cover. So anything they do wouldn't need a permit until they start doing activities that look like one of the codes that we cover. So I just wanted to point that out. This just going through the website actually works better than talking about it in my presentation. Yeah, so there's the website. You can see, for example, so what we're looking at is the division descriptions, and they give a major group 50, which you saw we have 5015 and 5093 under this permit. And then it goes into 5093, which is one of the 50 major groups. And then it tells you exactly the intent of that industrial classification that we cover. So like I said, the division descriptions are really important in some of these divisions. So don't just look at a code and think, oh, well, yeah, that's me, I need the permit. Read what it says. Because, for example, if you just went to motor freight, transportation, and warehousing, because I was talking about these being under the transportation SIC codes we cover, if you just read this, because we cover 4225, it says establishes primary engaged in the warehousing and storage of general line of goods. The warehousing of goods at foreign trade zones is classified industrial 4226 and so forth. So you'd think, well, I store some goods and I guess I need a permit. But when you go and you read the division description, it talks about auxiliary functions. So this is where it gets into your company, and that warehouses may be auxiliary to what you're doing. It doesn't necessarily mean every warehouse in the state needs a permit. Well, there's a few we could think about. But so this is where the division description is crucial, because it talks about how facilities are classified as auxiliary, and when are you not auxiliary for the transportation SIC codes? When you start getting into long-distance trucking, which is where we see the most of it, and the pipeline transportation and things of that. That is where you get some facilities that look like they don't need a permit, but they're doing this long-distance trucking, and then ones that you think need a permit but don't because they're auxiliary. So it's really important to read the division description and make sure that that's understood before you move forward. So let's look at this again. So what do we know? Long's drugs. Do you guys think that we usually have long drugs in our permit? It's like think of it as a Payless or a Rite Aid or something. Do we cover those activities often?
No, not usually, Laurel.
Okay. So, but they do warehouse stuff, and maybe they don't do long-distance trucking, but they do maybe maintain some trucks where they have a lot of their stuff stored. Would they need a permit? And this is where stuff gets really confusing. So you have to break it down, and this is what Leo and I do almost every day. We get calls like this. So the way that you can kind of break this down is, okay, Long's drugs are like a Rite Aid. What's their first thing? They're kind of a service. And if you look at the SIC code book, or they have goods, they're not necessarily making them, they're kind of just selling them. And that usually falls under retail or service industry kind of stuff. So they're providing a service to the public, and they make money off of sales, basically. Well, do they have, they might, at this one distribution area, they might have some trucks and they might work on them. But does that make them a transportation company? And that's kind of where their primary SIC code is in the retail sector, but they may be doing enough trucking to transition them into one of the transportation SIC codes. And when that would be is when you do long-distance trucking, what the SIC code manual says is you go to more than one municipal area that's not contiguous. So if you go to San Diego, you go to Sacramento, you go to Reno. Okay, and you also work on those trucks, that means you're also a trucking company. You're not just doing retail, you're also doing trucking that's long distance and you need a permit. For the little short distance trucking, when you're not working on them and things like that, or even if you're working on them, that's considered auxiliary to your primary SIC code. And so, that's one way we would break down this, where they've got goods, and then the other thing is, okay, well then are they one of these warehousing facilities? Well, one thing you have to look at is, if it's a Rite Aid warehouse, they've bought the goods at that point. And so they own the goods. They're not being paid to store other people's materials. And so they're not considered a storage or general warehousing and storage company. That is considered auxiliary warehousing to their primary activity, which goes into the auxiliary bucket on this slide. So that's kind of an example. So we've kind of talked about some things, and we'll try one out, and this is for you guys on the phone to decide. So what if a business is paid to store products from, we'll just say, 10 different manufacturers of pipe in Nevada? Would they need a permit?
How's it stored? In like a warehouse, or is it a storage unit? Or
It's a large warehouse that is paid. Their business is storing other people's goods.
indoors, outdoors?
And they're storing, well, that's another part of this. That depends on what kind of permit. But would they need, would this permit even apply to them?
Yes.
Yes, it would. And they would be under 4221 and 4225. If they don't have exposure, they can get the NEC. If they have exposure, they get the NOI. And it has to be more than one company, so the majority of their stuff is not theirs. And they can't, if they don't own the materials, that's another thing to look at. And then they may also be trucking, so you have to consider, okay, are they also, or maybe not just warehousing, but they're also doing trucking. So, yes, they would need a permit. So, how about this one? Businesses buy products from multiple manufacturers in Nevada, stores them, and has a customer order for the materials. There's no long-distance trucking or vehicle maintenance at the facility.
I think yes again.
Oh, I was thinking no, because it's not manufacturing, it's just buying and selling.
Right. So here's how this one works, and we can talk about it, is they've bought the products, so they own the products. They're not doing the long-distance trucking, and they're generating orders as a service. So the customers come in and buy products or have orders placed from a business that owns the materials. So they wouldn't need a permit. They're under the retail service industry.
Okay, I see that now.
It's tricky though, isn't it? It gets all gray areaed with these kind of situations. So then another one, so for example, if this business didn't own the products, and they were storing them for other retailers or something, maybe it would start looking like they're actually doing warehousing. But if they own the goods and what they do is sell things in a retail setting and they're not doing the long-distance trucking, is in a primary activity sort of manner, then they usually don't need a permit. Something to consider, too, in the SIC Code framework and this permit, we've had a lot of different takes on what to call industrial codes. Do we call them all primaries? Do we call them primary and secondary? Do we call them primary and auxiliary? In the purpose of electronic reporting in this permit, you have multiple primary activities, and the only SIC codes we really want to know in the reporting of this system is your primary SIC codes that got you into the industrial permit. So, for example, if your primary thing was auto dismantling, but you also did some R&D that was not commingling with your industrial activity, we don't necessarily need the R&D industrial code for the permit. So, for example, take a military base, and their military code is 9711. Their activities that are strictly military, they're, where they store equipment for some of their operations and things like that, that has nothing to do with an industrial code, that would all be under 9711.
So they're out.
Well, those parts of the facility, and that's what this slide gets into. So, we've talked about some of the more complicated, the transportation SIC codes and the landfills are the most complicated in the permit, in my opinion. So what we also have is, well, what if you have like a campus facility? We've talked a little bit about auxiliary activities. We've established that we only, each SIC code that gets you in the permit is a primary activity. And so when we're talking about what requires you to get the permit, we're talking about multiple economic activities that make up a majority of the facility. And so, for example, here's a military base. And they have all kinds of stuff. They have housing, they have training grounds, they have cafeterias, they're like a little city. They have places where they land planes, all kinds of that. So when would you need a permit? Well, it's when you do something where you can draw a line around it, basically, that is a primary enough activity that you look like something that isn't a military base. So if you put a line around this shipbuilding, you'd look just like a shipbuilder at a port or something of that nature. And so when you can do that, you're starting to look at, and you have to ask a lot of questions to get this sometimes out of callers, but you say, okay, well, what do you do? And they say, well, I'm building ships and I'm repairing them. Or maybe I have some ships, and then you have to ask them, well, do you build them there, or do you just bring them in? And if it turns out, they're actually building and repairing ships, and then they send them somewhere, that's industrial activity. That's not research and development, and that's not auxiliary. That's too far off of the way of saying that that's auxiliary to being a military base. They could have somebody else make them and bring them in. Unless they're doing proprietary research and development stuff, we assume that those activities are similar, and we have kind of a memo from 1992 that talks about look-alike facilities. So another one, a lot of these kind of campus facilities, it's not just picking on the military, they have landfill operations. And these are direct SIC code out of the manual, and they're a direct category of activities that we cover. They would need a permit for that landfill activity. And then another example would be airfields. If they've got, like an airport, they've got planes and they're fueling and all that, that's an industrial activity that we cover. But things like where they do their military training and all of that, yeah, they have pollutants, and maybe they're doing some milling and stuff for some weapons, I don't know. But none of that would be something that this permit covers. So then you'd have just a few compliance areas on the campus that you would have to be responsible for.
Laurel, I have a question on that. So what if some of those activities are potentially running onto your site? And those are from maybe, like you said, activities that are not industrial activities.
You mean if your non-industrial water runs onto your industrial area? Or mean you have run-on from a military base?
Yeah, if you have run-on from a military base, but they're not covered under industrial permit.
Yep. If that run-on commingles with your industrial stormwater and it discharges, you're responsible for it.
Yeah. All right. Own the run-on, right?
Yeah, I know. And I mean, I kind of make a joke, but maybe it's not a joke. Some people may be going to court over that. Because, if they're not being responsible and they're causing issues down the pipe, that's all things that the facility has to work out.
Laurel, this is John Troskus. I wanted to address the campus setting, and we actually have some that are actual school campuses as well.
Oh, okay.
We have cases where we have these different activities, such as maybe a kitchen and also a automobile repair or bus repair facility. And sometimes they're contiguous, other times they're not. In this case that you're giving on the screen here with the military base, when would they need different permits? Would there just be one permit covering the entire military base, or would they have individual industrial permits?
So the difference between, do I need 3 permits or do I need just one? One cut we usually use is, does your facility span over a named road? We've used this one for a long time. So we would say, your on the left side of the road and then 2 miles down, then you have part of your facility on the right side of the road and it's not continuous, that would be 2 separate permits. Because there's other things in the middle that you don't own. When it gets complicated on these campuses, because you do own everything. And so it can be considered one area, unless you want to get 3 permits. We're not going to stop you, but you don't have to get one for the whole site, but that's what a lot of people do. Another thing that comes up is there is some regional board discretion. You know, if you're got part of your facility across that named road and then right across from it you have part of your facility, they may say that's continuous enough, but you have to work through those with the region when they're that close. Another one that comes up with that continuous area is oil wells. When you have, 100 acres, how far apart can those be before it turns into 20 permits? And that really does come down to regional board discretion. But the first thing you look at is the named roads to kind of see if you can break things into more reasonable chunks.
Okay, because on a very large campus, having it all under one permit brings in a lot of non-industrial areas as well. Would it not?
But it also draws more attention potentially to those specific areas instead of, it just depends on how you do it. A lot of facilities like this have a permit for the whole site, but then they clearly outline in their site map where the industrial activities are, and everything else would just be kind of grayed out. And so then you're sampling where, I thought maybe you're going to ask this, is that, well, where's my sample most representative? And you can either take it at your discharge location, which may not be that representative of your industrial activity, or you can take it closer to your industrial activity that represents more what your actually contributions would be at the industrial portion. Because, for example, in my picture here, you can see, say that shipyard there, all the water maybe goes south, and then it just goes through maybe this point, the discharge point's down here at the road. Look at everything you're picking up. You can propose alternative discharge locations that are more representative of your industrial activity, but then, it just depends on how your site's designed, which way you want to go with it.
Okay.
Because yes, if your shipbuilding activity was up there where the little yellow line goes, and then your sampling point was 3 miles down south, I would say that you're picking up everything that isn't required to be covered by the permit. And so you may want to find a more representative sampling location. And with these large facilities, I encourage talking to your regional board about, if they're okay with that. But that's kind of how we outline the permit and all the monitoring and implementation stuff. You do have leeway to describe your permit, how you're implementing your program for your industrial sources.
Now, Laurel, for these large campuses, some of them may be a non-traditional Phase 2 MS4.
Correct.
What's your read on, do these facilities need double coverage by both permits? Is there some factor there? Because we've had plenty of discussions with regional boards about these types of questions. When would being covered under a Phase 2 MS4 exempt you from the industrial general permit?
So they're always going to go hand in hand. The reason for that is that the Phase 2 permit doesn't control it doesn't have the same level of implementation for industrial sources as the industrial NPDES permit. And so they have a Phase 2 permit that requires them to do inspections and things of their industrial facilities in their jurisdiction. And then they also have a requirement to be sampling those industrial sources, just like they have to get the construction permit too.
Okay.
Because they're kind of separate activities that they're doing. They've got this large impact, it's like acting like a city, and then under that, they have also responsibility to have industrial permit for those hot spots, if you will.
Okay.
And same thing, if you're constructing over an acre, you need the construction permit.
All right.
Laurel, this is Michelle Canan, kind of just stepping back to that warehousing and trucking question. What about grocery stores that have warehouses, transportation, and then their retail facilities?
So you have trucks coming, like a Safeway?
Yeah.
Where you have trucks coming in the back. They're putting stuff inside the refrigerated part of the store, and then they're putting it out on the shelves.
Yeah.
So that would be under retailer, because they're not, what they're doing is they're selling groceries. They've bought the goods from their distributors, right? They're not selling other people's materials at that point. They've already got them paid for. They're not doing maintenance on those trucks. I've never seen them do that at one of those kind of facilities. They come in and they leave. The facility that does the trucking, where they're actually working on the long-distance trucks, that maybe they go from Reno to Sacramento to Stockton, those kinds of trucks, where they're working on them and storing them, that's a long-distance trucking. So some of Safeways may have, wherever they get those trucks, that may be something that needs the permit. But where they actually the truck comes to the grocery store, even the distribution center, if they're not working on the trucks there, that's just a distribution center of the goods that the company owns, because they're still the primary activity of retailing groceries.
Okay, thank you.
Until they turn into long-distance trucking and work on the trucks. Okay. So, and that kind of gets into, we talk a lot about auxiliary functions in the industrial permit fact sheet. And if your primary activity is that grocery store, and you don't fall into that long-distance trucking like we talked about, because then you can't say it's auxiliary, because the SIC Code manual says that. You can have maintenance shops for forklifts, you can have storage of your materials, and your administrative offices. That's all auxiliary to you doing selling groceries. Now, if you need a permit, this happens with landfills, and they store or work on garbage trucks or something at the site, it can be rolled into your permit if that's something that would need a permit. So you can have some of these functions that's why we have maintenance shops and things. If it's actually at your site, you can have them require to be part of your pollution prevention plan. But if you have it away from your facility, and it's not always necessarily an exposure concern, you may not need a permit for that.
Not that I'd recommend it, but you could have two separate permits. If you have a maintenance shop and a landfill, have one for each, right?
Correct. You could. Yes. And then I would assume that that's because two different entities own, and so that the landfill operators wouldn't be able to make decisions for where they're doing the truck maintenance or something like that. So then, it wouldn't make sense to be covered under one permit, because you can't control the discharges from that part of the site.
Actually, it's pretty common where one party's owned by like a public entity and the other is owned by a private company or operated by a private company.
Right, and so I can see why that would be two different permits. Because if, for example, if it's all under the landfill, and this is what happens with airports and stuff, if the landfill says, okay, yeah, you can come in and be part of my permit, and then you say, well, you need to put in some best management practices here, and they say, well, we can't afford it. Guess who's the one that has the permit?
Yeah.
So it can be a liability to not have the proper ownership of the site. So, where would things not be considered auxiliary? We had a really good question come in not too long ago, and it took us a while to figure it out. But we had a recycling company, but 10 miles down the road, they had a maintenance yard. Okay, well, they would usually just be working on their trucks. That would be fine. But what they also did is the trucks that they were working on actually were recycle collection trucks, very much like a waste management situation. So they turned into not just being a recycling company, but they were also getting recycled materials as a contracted pickup service. And so they actually needed to get a permit for that maintenance yard where they actually had that activity going on. But it takes a long time sometimes to figure out what people are actually doing. I think that one took a week. Okay. So, and we kind of already talked about this. So, services are different than manufacturing. Just because you sell the rocking chairs that somebody made or assembled, it doesn't mean that you need the industrial permit. And just like I said, assembly is part of manufacturing. So keep that in mind. You have to consider custom orders versus mass production. For example, the guys that buy granite, the contractors that buy granite countertops and then they customize them, they do have to cut a little tile for a custom order, and then they install the countertop, is not the manufacturing at a mass production level of countertops. They didn't make the raw material and bring it in, smash it down, or produce the countertops. They're just customizing something that's already been manufactured. So there's a big difference between those two things. Same thing with cabinets. Where they get the big, large cabinets, or even the cabinet kits, where you get, the cabinets that you're going to be putting into housing. That's very different than if you make a few custom cabinets and then you have them installed by a contractor, because you're not getting in the raw materials and doing that at a large scale. And it does come down to a smell test. And then a lot of times we ask people what percentage of the time do they do a certain activity. So, for example, an auto repair facility would traditionally never need the industrial permit. If they started saying, well, we also do dismantling, so we get a car in, it can't be fixed, we buy it from the owner and then we part it out, you'd ask them, how often do you do that? If they say every week, well, that's the dismantling. If they said once every 10 years, it's an incidental kind of thing. And I'm not saying that's the guidance from the state board. I'm just saying those are the kind of things that we have to ask, and that comes into the smell test of the inspector or whatever professional is working on the case. And then this slide, it shows the repair shop versus someone in this factory. You could imagine it's manufacturing automotive parts or something. It's very different than working on some cars, which there's local ordinances for working on automobiles. So, and then I like to end with this slide. It's what don't we cover in the industrial permit, other than all those codes in the SIC Code book that we don't get into. We don't cover construction and land disturbing activities in the industrial permit, other than some special considerations with landfills and things where if you're doing a lot of ground disturbing, it's part of your industrial activity. We clearly delineate when it's a landfill and when it's a construction project. If you have an NPDES permit, an individual one, or you're covered under a different NPDES permit for your stormwater, you don't need a permit. If you don't have stormwater discharges that enter water of the United States, you don't need a notice of intent or no exposure certification. You would potentially be filing a technical report for a notice of non-applicability. I already talked about the oil and gas facilities. If you haven't had a report of quantity of sheen of oil, you have that federal exemption. If you're a mining facility and you don't have, pretty much you only have non-contact water, stormwater, then you are exempt. And then we don't cover tribal lands in this permit. They have their own regulations from the EPA. Okay. Well, thank you.